Welcome to Beyond the Reformer, the podcast where those who love Pilates come together for thoughtful conversations, genuine insights, and inspiring stories. I'm your host, Nick Lenny, and through these chats, I hope you feel more connected to our community, more aligned in your purpose, and inspired both in your Pilates journey and beyond. My guest today is Dinah Siman, the powerhouse behind Menopause Pilates. From single mum to Pilates teacher to a niche pioneer, she's built a movement that's changing how we support women in midlife. This episode is full of insight, impact, and inspiration. Let's get into it. Hi, Dinah. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate your invitation.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here. I feel like I was just saying to you, I feel like I have seen you on Instagram for such a long time, and we'll get into your work around Menopause Pilates because you're a real powerhouse in that area. I'd love to start though at the beginning of your Pilates journey. When was it you decided to train, and what was it that led up to that? What were you doing before?
Oh, goodness me. So we're going back to the 1990s. I started trying Pilates in the early 90s. I had done a lot of dance and fitness teaching because it was the era of aerobics and jazzercise and all of this kind of thing. And I had always danced as a youngster and I loved all of that. And I had a teacher who was my jazz teacher. And she got more and more into movement teaching, and she trained to be a Pilates teacher in the early 1990s. So I was living abroad. Every time I'd come back, I'd do classes with her, and I just got more and more interested in it. And then in 1997, 98, roughly that time, I was going through a really difficult divorce. And this teacher, who I'd known for many years, said to me, I'm now able to start training teachers. Would you like to train with me? Because I'd always done stuff with her. And I thought, actually, I would love to. This is a whole new step in my life. I didn't really know what it meant, to be perfectly honest. But I said, yeah. So I was her first student with an apprenticeship, a 2-year apprenticeship. And that's kind of where it all began.
And what was that transition like for you? Because I saw your Mother's Day post recently. You had 2 quite young boys at the time. That must have been quite full on, but amazing to do an apprenticeship. I mean, it doesn't really exist now. But what was that like, that transition for you?
The first year was like baptism of fire, if I'm honest, because I was going through a very difficult divorce in London and the training was in Oxford. So I would drive from London to Oxford 2 days a week. And I would go into her studio in Oxford. And an apprenticeship basically meant you were there all the time and you observed teaching, you did your own session, and then you start to teach. And basically the first day, I mean, there was no kind of, here's the theory, these are the principles, none of that. It was right, watch this, right, now you teach it. To begin with, I thought, gosh, I think I learned by osmosis. It just kind of, and the more you do it, because I'd done some, but I hadn't done a huge amount at that point myself. But I'd always been moving and teaching. So I did that, drove down from London to Oxford 2 days a week, and I'd have to get back in time for the school pickup. So it was always a bit of a mad, crazy time. And I was also having to keep what I was doing confidential because of the divorce I was going through. It was all very difficult, but it was something that really kept me going because I really started to love it very early on. I've always loved teaching. And I've always loved teaching movement. I was a primary school teacher, but movement was my thing. So I would say that for me, it was a lifeline, an absolute lifeline. And of course, in those days, in London, people knew what Pilates is, but out of London, not many people did.
Yeah, I mean, big difference to today for sure. But also amazing that you got to do, 2 years apprenticeship. I mean, it is really what's needed. You realize how much, even when a training, the amount of, you need to see real people. Like you said, I always learn more from the clients than you do from any training. So it's amazing that you got to do that. What happened? You'd done the 2 years. What came next?
So I taught for a while in the studio in Oxford and I started teaching mat classes locally to me. And then I got a job at Bisham Abbey, which is the training centre for Team GB for different sports. And this is back in about, I think it was 99, 2000, maybe 2000. They had a reformer. They had a physio who knew all about Pilates. And so I started working 1 day a week with GB hockey. And I was working with the women's team and some of the guys as well. And that was a real eye opener because, you got sort of guys of 22, 23 who were on the verge of having a hip replacement and they were told you have to go and do Pilates. It was amazing actually. And I also started teaching Oxford University Cricket Club. So I had a lot of different avenues, which was great. By this time, I'd relocated to Oxfordshire and I was able to manage that around taking kids to school, picking kids up, all that kind of thing. And also I drove miles, absolutely miles, as you do when you don't have a studio and you're in the country. And the number of times I spent trying to explain to people what is Pilates. But it was really good. It was really good.
So when did your own, because you've got a home studio, is that right?
No, I've always had studios away from home. So I
Okay.
opened my first studio next to a physiotherapy clinic in 2001.
And how was that transition then going from, did you stay working for another studio or did you kind of go straight into your own space?
No, by that point, I wasn't working in any other studios. What I'd done was think, okay, this is where my studio, I'm going to locate it. It was actually a physio in the clinic. He said, this space is becoming available. Why don't you turn it into a Pilates studio? And I thought, oh my goodness me, can I take on a lease? It's all scary stuff. And what I did was I had mat classes in all around the area. So I kept a few of the mat classes going, but then I just kept talking to people about what I was doing. So I transitioned. I opened the studio and I did a mixture, working in there and then still doing some mat classes to make sure I could pay the rent on the studio as much as anything else. And then, of course, I only had one reformer at that point, and I was shipping the equipment from the States, and that took a long time. It was a lot more complicated in those days.
Oh, I remember even when I opened my studio 10 years ago, getting equipment was like a feat in itself, wasn't it? For sure.
Totally,
So
totally.
so did you just have like a one-on-one space or did you do small group
No,
equipment? What did you
no.
do in your studio?
Yeah, well, the thing is, when you trained as an apprentice back in the 90s, you teach in the style where you will have a group of clients, but everybody's doing their own individual program, which you probably know. And we used to teach in those days up to 6 or 7 people at the same time, all doing different programs. And the class would be an hour and a half long. So that was the model I'd learned. So I took that model into my studio and I had space for 6 people and the classes were an hour and a half long. And again, I still taught, somebody was on the reformer, somebody was on the mat, somebody was on the big Swiss ball. It was, to begin with, it was like, I don't have so much kit. I had foam rollers. Again, getting hold of those back in those days was quite tricky, but I got them. And then in 2002, my equipment arrived. It took 5 months to come from the States, and I had another reformer and I had a Cadillac. And then I managed to add in a chair and a barrel, which I got from Stott, who were then coming into this area as well. So I gradually built up my studio. But yeah, it was groups of around about 6 to start with. And then we gradually reduced the length of the class, because an hour and a half is a long time.
An hour and a half is a long time, isn't it? I have been thinking about, actually, we have our first studio is a small equipment studio and we kind of run it a bit like a circuit class. It's the terrible analogy, but it's the best way to explain it. But I have been thinking recently actually about bringing that kind of more Pilates individual model back into a different kind of group class. I think it's quite interesting where people can still then work on their personal programs. It's an interesting model to kind of look at and allows people to continue their one-on-one work, I guess, in a more affordable option.
Yeah, it does. You're right. And I gradually, over the years, I went down from 6 to 5. If I had another teacher working with me, sometimes we do 7 or 8. But then if I was on my own, I gradually got down. And now I'm down to 3 in a group, which is my favorite number to teach. But I've always done that style. So I've stayed with that style.
I love that. So what took you from there, into the menopause Pilates work? You've carved out such a strong niche with it. How did that come about?
Well, over those years, so when I opened my first studio in 2001, the following July in 2002, there was this big report from the World Health Initiative, which declared that HRT was dangerous, caused cancer, caused breast cancer. And women literally overnight came off HRT. We now know, of course, that report was inaccurately interpreted and there is not this correlation. However, what I had discovered, because of course, back in those days, getting people coming in I mean, I'm very fortunate in the Cotswolds. It's a great area. People are interested in their health and have been. And my first studio was next to a physiotherapy clinic. So people were being referred, which was great. But I had started to notice once this happened that I'd got more and more women who were being referred to me because they'd got random aches and pains, fibromyalgia type pain. They've got all sorts of stuff going on, which nobody really knew what to do with because nothing was helping on the physio front. And I could also see the women who I was already teaching who stopped taking their HRT and what effect it had on them. So I was starting to clock that there was something that this hormonal shift was causing, but nobody was talking about it. And my clients, just occasionally they talk about hot sweats, but not a lot. But in my experience of teaching them, I was coming across things like the crawling skin and more clients with frozen shoulders, Achilles tendonitis, anxiety, all sorts of stuff happening, dizziness. And I was just thinking, there has to be a link, but no one is talking about it. And I was in my 30s at that point. So menopause was like way off in my head. But I just kept finding that I would hit a brick wall with some clients. Some of them would recover from Achilles tendonitis and some wouldn't. What was the difference? And I just kept thinking that somewhere along the line, I would get told on a training course, or somebody would tell me that there must be a link with the hormonal shift. But of course, nothing came. And it's not that Pilates teachers were being excluded from information. People just didn't talk about it. And physios, unless you're a women's health physio, they didn't learn about it. So when I gradually got towards my own perimenopause and started to personally experience things, the penny really dropped. I'm like, okay, I haven't been crazy about this. This is correct. This information is correct. There is a link. So I started to do a lot more research for myself. And I just felt that having taught all these years without this information, which actually is information that new teachers need, as soon as they start teaching, because we all teach someone who is impacted in some way by menopause, whether they're experiencing it themselves or whether a member of their family is or a work colleague is, and that it's an educational process. So I was really fired up to actually try to create something which would help teachers. That was my initial aim, simply because I'd wanted it.
I just feel really privileged to be going through my own perimenopause in this time when there is so much information out there, although still you feel like you're pushing against the grain a little bit. But I feel really privileged. I think we're so lucky in our world that we get, so like one of my studios is in an osteopathic practice. We have women's health in there. I get to have access to some amazing people who are like similar, Nick, do you think the fact that you've got vertigo out of nowhere might be something to do with this? I had lots of pain in my joints. I had the most horrendous exhaustion. I cannot tell you what my exhaustion levels were like. And the GPs were like, you're too young. End of. Well, I went on HRT a year ago. Absolutely life-changing for me. I am like a different person. And I think about my mum, actually, who, like you said, that generation were of that age. HRT was this bad thing, and therefore menopause was just not even discussed. Like, I think me and my mum are like hormone copies. Like, we have the same pregnancies, the same births, everything. And I think about how difficult I found it. And my mum must have found it. But even to this day, she's like, oh, I don't think it was that bad. But I remember how she was in her 40s. And I think she did find it quite tough. So it's interesting, like you said, I feel like when people come to see us, they open up a lot, don't they? You start to hear things, and often we're trying to put bits and pieces together and go, well, this is interesting. And with the information I've learned recently from people like you, and there's some amazing people out there really talking about this now, you hear clients, don't you? Frozen shoulder, arthritic toes suddenly that have appeared, and all these kind of things. And you're like, well, do you think? And they're like, well, I'm too young, or I don't have night sweat, so therefore I must not have perimenopause. And so it's starting to educate them. So it's amazing that you had started to see this in your clients before it had happened to you. And then, like you said, when it was happening to you, what was your experience when you went into perimenopause?
Horrendous. In a word. And I think, you're absolutely right. The joining the dots, putting things together, because also my mother's generation, your mother's generation, they didn't know the wide variety of symptoms. So if they're not sleeping well, if they've got anxiety, they wouldn't put that down to hormones. It's got to be night sweats or hot flushes and no periods. But, I never, ever had a hot flush ever. But I had the ongoing pain, which got worse and worse and worse. So I almost had to stop teaching. Old injuries got worse. My hypermobility got worse. I had chronic and continuous UTIs. I started fainting. I was losing my hearing. It just went on and on. My anxiety was skyrocketing. It was it was awful. And it took me a long time, even though I knew what was going on, to really, particularly the pain aspect. I understood a lot of the other stuff, but to actually go and get help, because my mother had breast cancer. So I hadn't yet twigged that actually I could use HRT, because I'd still got that old information. Oh, no, HRT causes breast cancer, which it doesn't. But, that story is so strong, and it's done a massive disservice to women's health, because we are 20 years behind in our research and understanding, because HRT isn't for everybody, but it does a great deal to help many people. And there are other things which will help, but the research on them was just, doesn't happen. So for me, actually getting a handle on my perimenopause so that I could get on with life again. Because I came to the point where I thought I was going to have to close my studio. It was so bad. And I've seen so many teachers over the years who basically burn out. They think it's burnout. Actually, it's often menopause. And I found that in my teacher training course, people in tears because they've suddenly gone, oh my goodness me. This is what's happened to me. I thought I was going mad. I thought I had a real problem. Brain fog, all of these things. So I think as much as on social media we feel like, oh, great, everybody's talking about menopause, they're still not. And as you said, studios, classes are great environments for people to feel safe and to be learning, for us to share education and for them to also share.
I found over my years teaching, I mean, I'm a very open person. I love to chat, and I'll chat about anything. And I think it's really important as teachers that we are open. When I in the past have talked about my miscarriages, because it's come up in conversation, there'll always be someone who comes up to me. When I've talked about digestive issues, people will come up to me and say, can you tell me about that? And recently talking about perimenopause, and I'm 42, people are like, you're too young. And I'm like, well, I'm not, because I was really lucky to see a specialist gynae because my GP wasn't helping. And I went and I said to her, I'm not here because I think if I've paid privately, you're going to give me something. I've come because I want to be honest with you about what's going on. And I want you to be honest with me about what you think is the best solution. Because friends had said to me, if you go to the GP and you give this script, then you'll tick the boxes. And I was like, but I don't want to lie. And again, people will ask me, and then I think through my own research, and you're right, I suppose I'm feeling like there's a lot of stuff out there, but I've done my research and I listen to a lot, and I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I hear great people talking. But it is, like you said, they are symptoms that aren't obvious. So for me, when I was going to the doctor for 2 years, it's interesting you talk about burnout. I was saying to the doctor, like, I am exhausted to the most insane level. I never talked about anxiety and I never talked about depression, because in my mind, I was anxious and low because of my own exhaustion. And I only really realized I had anxiety and depression, something I'd never had in my whole life. I'd never had it, when it went away. And I said, I now understand why people are getting given depression and anxiety medication, because I could have very easily framed my symptoms in that way. But what I was feeling more than anything was exhaustion. And of course, then the narrative was, you've got 2 small children. My son is a terrible sleeper. And I remember when I went back for my checkup with my gynae, and I said, the difference is now when my son has a bad night, I'm tired, I'm not having dark thoughts. I realized I also was having horrendously scary dark thoughts sometimes. It was so bad. And the bit that I found almost the most interesting is my thumb joint got really painful. I had steroid injections in it, and I was doing all the physio, and nothing really helped. And the bit that I always think, because some of these symptoms, they're a little bit fluffy, aren't they? Like sometimes it's hard to be like, am I definitely better? Am I not better? But the bit I always think is my thumb. It was like week on week, it had been getting worse. And then week on week with HRT, I started to feel the pain. I'm not saying it's completely gone, but that go away. And so I can only imagine hearing some of your story about the pain you were having in your whole body, how that must have landed. And it's so hard for us, isn't it? When we're movement teachers, you got to be able to move. And also you feel like you should be and you should be invincible to this stuff because we've done all the right things. So that's really hard.
But, we've also very often overdone it in our bodies. So we're going to have potential for more inflammation. And testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, they're all nature's anti-inflammatories. And it wasn't until I'd been on HRT for about 6 weeks and I increased my dose that my pain levels dropped. I had to get the right dose. And it was like, oh my goodness me. But like you, my knees and my toes, they had gotten really sore over a number of years. And I just thought, well, it's because I do so much movement. Once my HRT was doing its thing, no more sore knees, no more sore toes, no more sore shoulders. It's just, and for some people it works really well. It doesn't work for everybody. But you have to have the movement and the diet and the sleep and the stress management. You have to bring that in. And I think that's what's the great thing about HRT. It doesn't fix you fully. It's not a magic pill in that sense, because you're replacing your hormones. So just as we've always had to work with our hormones in our body, we still have to do that. We still have to understand that. But I think what you said just earlier about, look, once you were through it, you could see what had been happening is very key, because women or whoever is experiencing menopause, very often we can just accommodate a symptom. We think, okay, it'll go in a bit, and then maybe it does go, and then something else comes, and you just start to things just keep adding in, and you get used to being in a certain state, and then you can't necessarily get yourself out of it. And it's only when you do, if you go to ask for help or a friend said, look, I think you need to go to your GP or whatever, that you can then see what had happened. But I think this is one of the problems with menopause. It creeps on you. And you're absolutely right. You can get symptoms very early on in age. It just depends what is happening in your body.
The thing that was interesting for me, I'd like to mention as well before we move on and talk about your work with Pilates and menopause, is for me, after being on it for a while and being like, this is, oh my God, I'm like amazing. Life is back to normal. My gynae decided to change me from the bioidentical progesterone tablets to the coil because she thought that would just make sense. And I actually went into a massive relapse and I realized actually for me, it was the progesterone was just as an important component. And I think this is what I think is challenging it's around all things holistic health, isn't it? Like there's no one size fits all. It's like, I always joke, it's like a recipe. And if I wrote about my recipe, it wouldn't be the same as what your recipe is. And this is what's hard, where you can't kind of say categorically. And the hormones is tricky, isn't it? Because you're constantly having to play with them. And for me, when I shift anything, even if I end up in a great place, I feel horrendous for a good couple of weeks. And then I have to sort of decide then if I feel good. Luckily, my gynae, again, I think having such a great gynae, she was like, this is sort of not what we do, but I think you need to have the coil and some progesterone. You clearly need it. And then that seemed to stop, but in that period, the anxiety came back, the pain came back. And I know from clients and friends that I talk to, they can feel like it's not for them. But like you said, it's about playing around with the dosage. And it's tricky because there's no like, this is what you need. And it's not like you take it and the next day you're better. It can take a while. And it's hard, that, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. And I think this is the bit which there's not sufficient experience with yet, because also with GPs, a lot of them don't have training and understanding. And so they're not confident necessarily of how to manipulate the elements. And as an individual, we have to have patience. We have to figure out, what is it we're doing? Did I not get enough sleep? Did I have too much to drink? Did I eat something which doesn't agree with me? Am I too stressed? Because whatever is happening to you impacts how your HRT works. It can only do so much. And you're absolutely right. It does. And your needs change. So if you're perimenopausal and then you gradually go to menopause and postmenopause, your own levels change. So therefore, the levels you put in need to be adjusted. And finding that sweet spot isn't easy. And I think this is one of the problems that women have at the moment with seeing the medical profession. They need someone who knows how to support them with this. And we are short of people who can do that.
For sure. In that period in between, I went back to my GP and said, like, I mean, I was crying on Christmas Day. I was like, I just do not feel right. And they were like, you need more estrogen, because that's, and she was saying progesterone does not create these benefits. It does not do this. So I did what she said and I just felt really bad. I thought, you know what? I'm going to go back to my private gynae. I'm just going to see what she says, because she seems to just, like you said, she's a specialist. This is what she does. And she said to me, progesterone, for some women hate it, But for some women, and she said, I think you're one of these women, they need it. They struggle without it, and it helps them feel calm. It gives them the sleep. It kind of calms everything down. So we just switched everything around in a way that I wouldn't have had with my GP. And in fairness, for the GPs, they're not trained in this area. And also, when you see a gynae, I'm with her for an hour. And that's how long these conversations take. That hour I've had with my private gynae, I think every woman should have that. I learned so much. And she said to me, please share all these tips with everyone, because not everyone can see me, but I want them to know it because they're in themselves. What took you, Dinah, from this and what's going on to then kind of seeing maybe that there's a bit of a gap in the movement space and that Pilates can really help these people? How did that kind of come about?
Well, I did, because I'm also a yoga teacher and a gyrotonic teacher. And I did a menopause yoga training, the very first one actually, and with menopause yoga. And it was a longish course. And I'd already been thinking about the fact that Pilates teachers, I felt like we just didn't have access to the information. And I thought, you know what, actually, whilst yoga is amazing as a move, don't get me wrong, I love yoga and it can be very, very supportive. For me personally, in my perimenopause, I had to give up yoga because it was playing too much into my hypermobility and I needed more stability and strength. And it was Pilates, which I could sufficiently modify to micro movements to start moving again. Because I got to the point where I actually couldn't move. And I just thought, you know what, actually, what we offer in Pilates is perfect as it is. And whilst it is amazing to be able to go on a yoga retreat or to go to a specific class just for menopause, you could do that in Pilates, which is what I talk about in the training course. You can create a mat course, but we already have the skill set in the movement practice. It's just knowing what fits this particular stage in life and understanding how to recognize what your clients are presenting with and then how to support them, how to signpost them. So I just thought, you know what, we're perfectly located because we're in health and well-being. We offer a method of exercise which is very safe. Technically, we work on things to a degree that people really start to understand what they're doing with their body. If you like, we're kind of we're ground level, and we can help people access movement again when they've lost it or they don't want to go to the gym, or so I just thought, actually this is ideal, and people should know it.
You've been working with empowering teachers around teaching in this area. Are teachers nervous around this age group, this demographic of people, or do they feel confident? Like, what are you bringing to the table in these courses? What are you hearing from those teachers who turn up?
So I think my assumption always is, and it's always been the case, that the teachers I work with, whether online or when I've trained at Polestar or in London and in Bristol, they're already brilliant at what they do. And this is the thing about Pilates teachers, they do continuous education because they're passionate. They want to learn, they want to help their clients, they want to help themselves, but they are passionate about what they're doing. So they've already coming with a big repertoire of exercises at their fingertips. What they need to know is what you're looking for in this demographic. So I talk to them a lot about the symptom checker and how to recognize what your clients come to you with and be able to signpost your clients onto support and help. So, for example, if your client says, well, like you say, I get dizzy a lot, or I've got this ongoing pain, or I'm so anxious, I've suddenly developed migraine, all these things. When they say, if you know what you're looking for, you can go, okay, that's a red flag. I think I need to direct this client to this website and suggest they go and see their GP. Because otherwise, we are working in an environment where we're working blind effectively, because we know there is something wrong, but neither the client nor we know what it is. And I talk about it in my book. I had a lovely, lovely client who came to me and she was in tears because she'd got migraine, she'd got anxiety, she'd got back pain, and she got heart palpitations, and she'd had a cardiogram, she'd had a brain scan, she'd been given antidepressants, and nothing was working, but everything was separately siloed. And I looked at her, I said, has anybody suggested you might be perimenopausal? And she'd never even heard the word. So it may be that you are the only person if you know what you're looking for, who can say, look, this isn't, we don't diagnose as Pilates teachers, but this is a self-diagnostic tool, the symptom checker. Have a look at it, go and see your GP. And, for us as teachers, we do want to make life easier for ourselves. We do want success for our clients. And if you're working with a condition which you don't know about, or you don't understand what's causing an issue, then life is much harder, both for you and the client.
Yeah. And do you sort of see any common sort of fears or myths around working with this group of people from teachers?
No, not really. More that people just want to know, and yes, of course, there's a concern about if you're working with somebody, could they have osteopenia? Could they have osteoporosis? We don't standardly do DEXA scans here. So unless somebody has actually had one, they don't know. But if you understand what could be happening to a woman in the first few years after menopause, how much bone density she is losing, if you've got the information, then you're going to be able to plan safely your lesson, your class, your one-to-one for that individual. And so I think it's more about just wanting to know. It's like, okay, can we have this information because it just informs us.
So, what does a well rounded session look like? What kind of things should we be including?
For a perimenopausal, postmenopausal,
Yeah. And is it different from what we'd plan anyway?
not necessarily, but for example, if you, again, this is what with the course that I teach, you can take the information and you can create, say, a 6-week mat course all about menopause. So you can educate in that aspect as well. Or you can say, okay, I understand these elements, so I'm going to make sure that in this class, I could well have people who are therefore. And it is in many ways similar in that you want to do strength work, you want to do mobility work, you want to do breath work, body awareness, because the more aware and more connected to their body a person is, the more able they are to identify what's going on. And it may be that in this teaching, it becomes more obvious to you, your clients who are struggling. But again, if you know that anxiety and brain fog, I mean, I've had people who don't turn up because they've just forgotten because they've got brain fog. If you know that's a symptom, then again, it ups your awareness. So a class, again, if I'm teaching a class and I have no idea whether I've got clients with osteoporosis, but they are all of this demographic, and I have no idea if they're on an HRT or not, then I'm going to teach a class which doesn't involve flexion, massive loaded flexion. Bridging, fine, cats, fine, but I'm not going to put in an exercise like the hundreds or anything which involves forward flexion because I don't know. And I'm going to make sure I'm teaching movements which are functional, like the hip hinge, and making sure that everybody can, safely load before I add in the load. But I am going to want to try and bring in more weights, more resistance, this sort of thing for this demographic.
I was going to ask actually, do you think that the sort of weight work we do in Pilates is enough?
Depends what you mean by enough.
Well, I just hear a lot of people saying you need to do, you need to start doing kind of, weightlifting at this age. This is what you need to do. And I'm like, is there not enough? I feel like there's enough in the equipment and like work that we do.
It depends on the individual, again, I think, because if you've got somebody who has got osteoporosis and they actually do ultimately need to really increase their load lifting, then you've got to start them really with technique. You've got to make sure that they understand how to stabilize and how to lift. Yes, the work on the reformer is great. Yes, using resistance bands is great, but you're going to have to use hand weights and you're going to have to gradually, and leg weights, increase those and make sure you get impact movements like stomping and that kind of thing to start with. You've got to start at a low level and go up for sure. And I think that it's very, obviously it's not just about what you're lifting, it's about what you're eating, because you've got to be able to create muscle, you've got to eat correctly to be able to do that. And if you've got a client who's not on HRT, it's harder because we lose muscle mass, and HRT, we know, helps bone density. We absolutely know that. Now, again, I know it's not something everybody can or wants to take, But if you know you've got osteoporosis, you need to have medication, you need to be seen to make sure you're on the right track, and you have to look at your diet and exercise. So it's a tricky one. I think that Pilates is the best starting point, but I think depending on where your osteoporosis is and what it is you've been told you need to do, you may need to look at lifting heavier, but then that might not necessarily be in the Pilates environment.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. And I think, like you said before, women are often not as connected to their bodies. They feel like their bodies have slightly abandoned them. And Pilates, I think, really helps with that, doesn't it? It gives them that awareness. It lets them have trust in their bodies again, love their bodies again, appreciate what they're capable of. I think it's such a great place for people to start. I think sometimes some of the information around weightlifting, if you go from that place to the big stuff, it's just too much. So it's great to kind of get those techniques into you. So you've built such a strong online community. I mean, how did that happen? I feel like you have done so well with being like front and center, not afraid to be on camera, doing these movements. How did that come about? And then you've built this massive following.
It's quite funny, isn't it? I never imagined that I would do this because I never even had a website. I ran my studio for over 20 years without even a website. It was just before lockdown, and I had started writing the book. Sorry, no, I started writing the course. I hadn't yet written the book, but I was in discussions about the book. And I thought, okay, when it was one of my clients actually said, you've got to get on Instagram. I mean, I used Instagram, but just for family stuff. Said, you've got to do it. So I thought, okay, I will. So I started literally beginning of March when we went into lockdown. And to begin with, she said to me, you have to post every day at 6 o'clock. And I'm like, okay, I'll post every day at 6 o'clock. And I started out that way. And I think, there was good timing in the sense that, don't get me wrong, COVID was not good timing, but it meant that everybody was more online. And I started connecting to other people who were in that group, that community. And in the space at that point, there weren't so many people. So I connected up with Nigel Denby, menopause dietitian. I connected up with Emma. I'd already made connections with Newson Health. So I was talking to them about their Balance app at that point. And it just kind of took off. And I started just with photos. And then one of my sons is an actor, and he said, well, you just got to get yourself a tripod and just get in front of the camera. It's like, oh, I don't know if I can. He said, just got to do it. And I thought, okay, he's right. Get over yourself. So I just started, and, it's fine. I just take the view, if what I do can make a difference and help, that's fine. I'm perfectly happy to put myself out there because I want to make people feel empowered that they can help themselves. That's the key thing. And I actually genuinely enjoy Instagram. I have moments when it's like, but it's fun. It's usually quite fun. And I've met a lot of amazing people via Instagram. So I think in this particular sphere, it's been very helpful. How it will grow, I don't know. But yeah, I didn't expect to be doing what I'm doing. And my numbers actually came from one reel. One reel took off. I don't know why, but it did.
It's interesting, isn't it, how you sort of see this as quite a younger place, really, and you sort of see a lot of the fitness, and even the Pilates content on there is very much of that fitness, push yourself. So it's interesting. Like you said, I think a little bit of serendipity with the time that helped you kind of maybe get in front of people, but it takes a lot to come up with the ideas, to set it up. Don't think people ever know how much work goes into something that looks really simple.
Yeah, there is a lot of work, you're right. And also I have a habit of thinking I need to put out something new every time, which of course you don't, because like in teaching, things take a while and some people see it and some people don't see it. But I think also, I was looking at things on Instagram and thinking, well, actually, I could do that. And there's something that I've done for years, which I think might be helpful in that respect. So a lot of the stuff I've been doing for years, or maybe I come across it suddenly and think this is great. And sometimes it's somebody else's work and I'll say this is so-and-so's and I think it's great and do it that way. But you're right, it's not something. I mean, tomorrow I'm going to be 61. So I didn't expect to be doing this on Instagram at this point in my life. But there you go.
Happy birthday. But I just think that's such an achievement. And I've loved your content because it's so real. Like it's just, it's you, and I just love it. And I think that's why it's cut through, isn't it? Because it's authentic. And people need that. I think people need that. I think we as a studio, when we look at our marketing, I'm always like, I don't want the young people in the crop tops. Like, I don't want the aesthetic. Like, how do we get across how we want people to feel? Because doesn't everyone just want to feel better? And that's what Pilates has done for me and has done for me since my 20s and continues to do. It's always helped me feel better more than anything else. So you said that you were already thinking of writing the book.
Yeah.
How did that process kind of take shape? Tell me about that writing process.
So my mentor is Elizabeth Larkham. So I did the Balanced Body Diploma with her about 11 years ago. And I'd done various workshops with her. And during lockdown, when I was starting to write the course, I just emailed her and said, could we have a chat? And I said, look, I'm doing this. What do you think? Do you think it's a good idea? And she said, I think it's a great idea, writing the course. I said, okay, that's great. Thank you. And she said, would you like to write a book? And I thought, I didn't honestly think that it was serious. I said, yeah, of course, absolutely, not thinking anything would come of that. But Elizabeth is published author, as you know, with Handspring. And so she put my name forwards to write a book. So I then had to go through a process where I had to write if you like, a sort of plan of what it would be and jump through a number of hoops and send that in. And then the hardest bit of that is that what you've written, the chapter proposals, are read by different experts, at least 3, and then they send their criticism. So you have to read what they've said about your work. Anyway, fortunately, what was said was positive largely. Obviously, there were some negatives, but I had no idea what I was doing. I'd never written a book before. And Handspring said, yes, we'd like you to write it. So I signed a contract and I had 18 months to write it. And I have to say, when you've never written a book and you haven't got a clue, it's like, well, I'll just go for it and see what happens.
How did you decide what to include in it?
I took really the structure of the course. The course and the book really go together. And what I'd found over the years, particularly as I got into perimenopause, is that going on a training course and sitting for an hour and a half taking notes and then maybe doing 40 minutes movement and then sitting for another hour and a half, 2 hours, I was really, really struggling with that because we're movers. And often you're doing a course in a studio where you're not even sitting on something particularly comfortable. And if you've got injuries or pain, it's getting worse and worse and worse. So I designed the course to be divided up. So there's a bit of theory followed by a movement snack, followed by theory, movement snack. So there's a constant shift in how you're learning. Because also in terms of how we learn, we need to satisfy the brain, the body, the spirit, the whole lot. We have to feel what we're doing. So the book has a similar theme in it, in that I've looked at the history of menopause. I've looked at what menopause is. I've looked at the symptom checker. I've looked at different treatment pathways. I've looked at early menopause, looked at HRT. I've got 3 guest writers who talk about pelvic floor, fascia, and a doctor's viewpoint. And then there are lesson plans and ideas and things at the end. But in between each bit, there are ideas, thinking outside the box, things that a Pilates teacher might do for their own educational benefit, as well as movement practices. And then I've also got contributions from teachers around the world who have took my course in the first year about what is happening for them in their country. We're a global community now in Pilates, and the more information we can get and know where to look for it, the better. So I'm hoping that the book will be a resource that teachers can use. That's the idea of it. I don't want it to be a book that just sits on a shelf. It's not hugely academic. It is academic in that there are references to papers and research and so on. But it's a book which I wanted people to want to read, want to pick up and say, okay, what could I do this? I recognize that, or what have you, rather than oh God, there's another book I've got on my shelf type thing.
I have many of those books, and I think I'll have a read of them, as I'm in bed, and I'm like, they're too heavy. You have
Yeah.
to like do them in the day and have like a good time and be really awake. And it's
Yes.
lovely to have a resource, isn't it? It's lovely
Yes.
to go, like, it's lovely when you go on a course, isn't it? And you can come away with it with some ideas. So to have that kind of
Definitely.
idea in a book is fabulous. What's been the response to the book? Has it surprised you?
I've had some really nice messages from teachers, which is lovely. Yeah, I've been surprised by some people well, one in particular recently, a Chinese teacher who was on a workshop I was teaching, and she said she showed me her WhatsApp group of 100 teachers all reading my book together, translating it. So yeah, I was like, wow. So I have actually spoken to the publishers because she said, can we not have a Chinese version? So they're now investigating whether or not they can produce it in China. So that kind of thing, you think, oh my goodness me, it's just unreal, unbelievable. And it's a difficult one because it is niche in a way, but I really hope that teachers of all ages and genders read it, because we all need to know this stuff, and I think it's a bit like the scenery on a play. It's there all the time, but you need to see it.
I recently had someone come from China with an interpreter, and she said, so it's an interesting story. She basically runs training for women. That's kind of her business. And lots of these trainings are how women can work in the home. So it's lots of like cake training and things like that. Anyway, she came and she said, I want to bring Pilates teacher training to China because there isn't enough of it. And most people are going to Korea and to Singapore and stuff like that. And actually her reason was, as she said, we're really aware of the aging population here. It's in a lot of our press and people are seeing it, and what's available just isn't cutting the mustard. So I can totally understand why 100 people are reading it, because from what she was explaining to me in their culture, this is quite prominent conversations that are being had. People are really noticing that. What advice, Dinah, would you give for someone who's maybe looking to create something outside of the studio, whether that's write a book or kind of create content in the way that you have done it? Do you have any kind of advice for someone on that?
I would say if you were looking at social media to start with, then stay in your lane. If there's something you're passionate about and you know who your audience is, so you have to have an idea of who you're aiming at, then create your content, put it out there, check what works. Try not to be derailed by everything else, which is much harder to do than to say, because it's easy to look at somebody else's and think, oh God, I didn't do that, or oh, maybe I should be doing this, or oh, maybe I should be posting every day, or whatever. Stay with what you know you want to share and whatever your passion is. I definitely found taking a few courses was helpful on social media to understand more about how things change. So be open to doing that for sure. I've spoken to quite a lot of teachers over the last few years about how I do it, what to look for, and this kind of thing. And I think it's not being too attached to it, because it's very easy to get obsessive about it. So trying not to be, but just going, okay, that worked, okay, that didn't. But also being aware that if you put, 4 hours into something and it doesn't get the views you expect, then maybe don't spend so much time on it. I've learned that the hard way.
Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it? They sort of say by talking to one person, you actually talk to a good few. By trying to talk to everybody, you don't talk to anybody. And so Pilates is so great for everybody. And I think it can be hard for us to, like you said, stay in a lane and just try and talk to the one client that you feel really passionate about and let that grow. And it's been really interesting actually on this podcast to talk to a few people who have created some niches around this work. And it's not to say that their approach is wildly different from a more generalist approach, but it allows them to hone in on their marketing, attract the right person, and just be really clear on what they're doing, which I think is really interesting. And like I said, in a world where Pilates is, well, it's booming now in a way that it never has before. And I mean, we know, I mean, isn't there like some sort of saying that says you got a problem, like the answer is Pilates, because it just does so many good things for everybody. But it's been interesting to sort of see how I mean, you'd had this experience, but kind of how that ended up being a bit of a niche for you, really.
Yeah. And I think I've always loved networking, and I've also always loved one of the things I love about Pilates is it's so practical. It's phenomenally practical. I've spent all these years talking to my clients about, okay, in your toolkit, what have you got? What can you think of? And I love it when somebody says to me, yeah, now I think about what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, and what I can do from what I know to help myself. And that's kind of what I try to put across in my social media, that, okay, this is a tip, this is a tip. You can use this to help yourself in a certain situation, because there's so much fear of the body for people in menopause. The body becomes, as you said, something for many of us that, I mean, I didn't want to be in my body. It's falling apart around you. So I think if you can really speak to your passion, speak to what it is you want to share with people, that's the key thing on social media.
If someone was looking to create a book, do you have any tips for that? I feel like that is the whole world unto itself. I mean, like you said, I suppose you had a little link
Yeah,
with Elizabeth to get you
yeah.
into a publisher, but otherwise, I don't even know how you begin that process.
No, I agree. It wasn't something that had been on my radar. So, publishers like Handspring and Singing Dragon, who publish in the health and well-being area, they're always interested in hearing from people about ideas. You can submit your ideas. If you've got an idea for a book in our sector, then they're very up for hearing about that for sure. I think that obviously now I've written it once. If I were going to do it again, I'd do it differently. But obviously, you learn from experience. I mean, I found for me that I couldn't teach all day and then go and write in the evening, apart from family and so on. I just couldn't be in the two headspaces. I mean, I had to take time off. And so if you write a book, it is a labor of love in many ways. So I had to close my studio for a week so I could literally write for a week to be in it. And it's something which, you know, you do because you're passionate about it for sure. If you get a contract to write a book, in our kind of area and you're given an editor, what I would say is ask for as much help as you want. Don't be afraid to ask for help, because I had no idea who could help me or how they could help me or whether people would be looking at the chapters I was writing in advance. So now I have a much clearer idea about how you could do it. The key thing I would say is ask for help so that you know you're on the right track.
No, that's great advice. I didn't even know that you could kind of pitch ideas,
Yeah, you
and
can.
I mean that sounds
Yeah.
great, and
Yeah.
go about that. And like you said, it's such a good point. I think being in the right headspace and energetic space to have creativity is tricky, right? For me, I have moments where it comes, but that might not be when when I've blocked out some time to write some copy. So I can only imagine how writing a book would go. Just kind of looking to the future of Pilates, you've been such a big part now of helping shape teachers, like we've said. If you could shift one thing in how we educate teachers, would you bring some of this work into some of the more general education that's going out there? Do you see this always saying as a CPD piece? How would you like to shape that?
I actually think it should not be a CPD. I think it should be an element in initial training with the possibility to learn more, because I appreciate that in an initial training you can't cover everything. But, menopause of itself is not a medical condition, but it can cause other conditions. And I know when we train to teach, we have to have that generalized map. We're learning a syllabus, we're learning how to teach those exercises, but we also get to know about, disc pathologies, and we do have to have a degree of awareness on things. And I think that menopause should be in that at the outset, that actually you may have clients who are experiencing hormonal fluctuations or decline, and that is going to could impact their physical and emotional and mental state. So not to scare you, but actually you need to know about this. And then there could be a sub-module with more details in it for those, or directions to read this book, for example. I personally think that it should be right from the start.
It's such a good point. I think about even in my own, I run a comprehensive teacher training, and you're right. We talk about not just contraindication type pathologies, but lots of where people are at and how they are. And of course, osteoporosis and osteopenia come up massively in that. But within that, it's quite easy to have that conversation, isn't it? And in my training, one of our modules is around how we are communicating with our clients, how we're having those initial conversations, what information we're finding out so that we can understand their lifestyle and things that are going on. It would be quite easy to fit it into that, like you said, just to make a more rounded decision in what you're doing with them. And like you said, the word empower is the one that comes up for me a lot in Pilates. How do we empower people to take back control and be able to heal themselves, get them into a position to heal themselves?
Totally. And I mean, if you know that you've got a client, you could have a client who's 27, who's in premature ovarian insufficiency, who's got this premature menopause going on. They may not tell you that, but because it's something maybe they don't want to talk about initially. But being able to read the signs, or being able to have the conversation, or to say, look, if you have any hormonal issues or whatever. In the early years, I never asked about hormonal states for my clients. Definitely do now. A one-to-one, I was like, are you happy to share with me what your hormonal condition is at the moment, or state, or what stage you're at in your life? And I ask on my forms, are you on HRT? I specifically put that down, Because if you know someone is on HRT, then you know that their bone density is being protected. You know what's going on there. And, osteoporosis is a silent one. So it's a tricky one. But if you think, okay, so I can do this, this, and this with this person, I think it is a conversation which we should be having a bit earlier on.
I mean, we could have a whole conversation on osteoporosis. I feel like I feel very privileged. I've had a lot of education on this and probably still not enough. But yet, what I find really surprising is the women that I work with who have a diagnosis, who've been given no information on what they should do. And when you then try and educate them on the loaded flexion piece and explain to them why, some women can take real offense to it because they're like, my GP said I could do anything. And I always say to them, look, this is the information. I signpost them, go and look at this. At the end of the day, it's your body. You do what you want. All I can do in my capacity is tell you what I have been taught and what I believe. But you're in a class, you're in a mixed group class. I will give you variations that I believe are safe for you. But I've had it. I'm sure you have it too, where they will not do it. They're like, no, no, no. I want to do all the, short spines. And I'm like, oh, I really wish you didn't do that. But that's hard, isn't it? Because I feel like from the medical profession, they're not guiding them on that stuff from a movement
Yeah,
perspective.
very hard. I mean, I had a new client recently, and she had a diagnosis of osteoporosis, didn't know what she could and couldn't do, and was subsequently absolutely terrified of moving, which meant she was starting to get a bad back, which was nothing to do with the osteoporosis. But, learning simple things like how to unload the dishwasher safely, how to make a bed safely, how to empty the car safely. Again, as you say, if somebody's open to it, then they'll take it on. But you're right, there is a real lack of information on this I've seen over the years. When you say to people, do you know what you can and can't do? No, they don't.
What things would you sort of see in the next 5, 10 years with the Pilates world? Do you have any kind of ideas on where it's going? I don't know what your experience has been like, Dinah. One of the common topics that's been coming up in our conversations is in this boom that's happening at the moment. And, we don't have an official body. There isn't official regulation on trainings. There's a level 3 and there's a SIMSA and there's all these different things out there which don't really necessarily mean anything, which is a real challenge, isn't it? Both from a client coming into a studio, also from teachers. People that I'm talking to are like you. The depth of knowledge that they have means that these kind of topics that you're talking about seep in quite naturally to the teaching because we're teaching with depth, we're bringing awareness. Do you see that things might need to shift in the next sort of, 5, 10 years?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know how it's going to shift in that it's now getting bigger and bigger. And as you said, there are so many different training schools. It's always been there, but it's just bigger now. And obviously, there are elements like reformer Pilates has become so popular. And it's fascinating because people in the studio have always done reformer Pilates. It's just that it's not a separate element to Pilates. But don't get me wrong, it's great that there are people who are now introduced to it and it's more accessible. But again, I don't teach a group reformer class, but it must be complicated because unless you can actually be sure that the people who attend your class all have a certain level of knowledge, so that you can teach them as a group, it must be complicated, very complicated. Honestly, I don't know where it's going to go, to be perfectly honest, because obviously we have the PMA, but that hasn't really taken off big time over here. We've got big organizations like Balanced Body, we've got Polestar, we've got Stott, we've got the bigger schools. And it's very difficult to know how compliance to a certain level, how it can be achieved. I don't know. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know either. It's a comment that's come up a lot. I see that regulation is needed. And I was thinking of this walking the dog the other day. I was like, okay, Nick, you've decided you want to create regulation in the Pilates industry. Like, where on earth do you start? How do you bring it in? Like you said, the PMA in America did it. I believe Body Control have tried to do a similar thing in the UK. But really, what you're doing is paying money as a course provider to have your course sort of approved. No one's really checking the level of teaching. They're just at least checking that the curriculum is there and that the hours are there. It's tricky, isn't it? So much of our work, for example, our one-on-one work does fall into the rehab world. Yet, because we don't have an official body, we don't get the VAT benefits that the rehab profession do. Yet, I'm sure you have as well, the amount of rehab clients, we've seen sort of transform where physios sort of step back and we step in. It's a challenge. I'm not sure there's a solution either. I guess what there is, and kind of partly why I'm doing this podcast, is to bring more awareness. I think clients don't know there's differences. People doing trainings don't know there's differences. They don't understand the difference of a 2 weekend reformer course versus a year or 2 year or 3 year training. Some of them don't also understand that the qualification is the baby step, and then you've got to keep learning. And I want to create a thirst in our students, like you said. And I love that idea, and I'm going to steal it. I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to say, go and read this book if that's something you're interested in. And that's why we need more of this content out there, don't we? As a comprehensive training provider, I have people come on my course who've done a reformer course, a mat course, and I think their minds are slightly blown by the depth this work can go to, because they were very much taught that Pilates is, exercise and choreography, which is missing, like yoga, there's a whole ethos in there. So it's an interesting thing. And I guess it's just about having these conversations, isn't it?
Totally. And I think, whenever people have asked me about, oh, how do I find a teacher, or what do I do, or how do I find a course, then I always say, look, if you're looking for a teacher, go and watch the teacher teach. Go and talk to them. Go and talk to them so you can decide whether you relate to them, whether you understand what they're doing. Any teacher who's not happy for you to watch, I mean, I would be like, okay, why can't I see? If I want to pay to come in this class, then I'd want to know what you're doing. Most teachers are open to that. And you're absolutely right about the training. And it's been the same ever since, ever since I started, that first of all, you could only train with an apprenticeship. Then we started the mat courses. And then, of course, it all began to change. And then you would get these sort of fitness Pilates. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with fitness Pilates. But you're right. If you're doing a 2 weekend course, it's very different than if you've spent the best part of 2 years going for long modules and studying and learning all sorts of different things. So there are levels of qualification, there are levels of experience, and this is a bit of a minefield. But the good thing is, because Pilates is becoming so much more popular, you are, like with your podcast, there's more conversation around it. So more people are understanding that there are different things, that it's not just on a mat or on a reformer or whatever, that there are different ways of learning.
And I think that's what's been lovely about having guests like yourself on, is understanding the specialisms and the depth that this work could go, and the niches that are available, to hopefully educate people that, doing a load of lunges and weights on a reformer is fun. I enjoy it. I go and do it. When I'm in London, it's a laugh. But I've said this over and over again, almost every episode this comes up. That wouldn't have changed my life. It wouldn't have healed me. It wouldn't have got me past my chronic pain. And it's important that clients understand that. And it's like you, I taught aerobics. I went to the gym. I love that. I still love that. But so many people come because their body just doesn't feel great. I remember trying to run a marketing campaign once, and I was going to put it as, someone told me to do Pilates. I think for a long time, that's how people started. Someone said, a physio said, you should try Pilates. A friend said, someone said. Now, what is great is people know what Pilates is. They know what reformer is. We just need to get the message out there that there is differences, and then let people make their own choices on it, really.
Yes, exactly. And it's great that young people are able to do reformer classes at speed, because that's what they want to do. Because the idea of lying on a mat doing a micro movement doesn't appeal to them. But likewise, for your, 75-year-olds, knowing you can be on a reformer and just do some things which are going to make you feel better and mobilize a bit, and it's safe, works. So you're right.
That's what's amazing about this breath, isn't it? It's the
clever.
breadth of this work. It's very clever.
Yeah.
To end our chat today, Dinah, I'd love to ask you just a few questions I've asked everyone in this series. First one is, what was the most influential piece of advice you've been given, and by who?
Well, I think there is no one way is key. There is no one way. And, that's why, again, with this work, there is no one way necessarily to do a movement, because we move in so many different ways. There is no one way, you can modify, you can adjust things. And in life, we have to be flexible and move. And saying that, no, this is the way for me is like, well, that might not be appropriate for somebody else. So that, with balance, creating balance in life, I think those are fundamentally vital.
I was talking to another guest recently, and we were talking about how even in the movements of Pilates, learning the ease, the efficiency, the balance through the exercises, how that then seeps out into life when you think, oh, maybe I could approach this a different way. Maybe there isn't just one way. Maybe I could think about this differently. I think that's how Pilates ends up kind of shifting so much deeper than just the movements.
Yeah. And as a teacher, you learn that because you work with so many different bodies. You find, okay, so this works for this person, this doesn't work for that person. Let's change it and try this. And often it's instinct. You know, but it's an instinct. You feel it.
The next question is, what mentors have shaped your life?
Probably the two most influential were and are have been Alexander Filmer-Lorch, who was my meditation teacher, and then I eventually taught for him in his meditation school. He's written 2 books. His meditation school is Inside Meditation. I started to work with Alex back in about 2008, I think, and really found what I was learning massively transformational. And also Joe Avison, who was working with him. I started working with Joe before Alex, and then they set up the Art of Contemporary Yoga, which was a yoga school, and I did a 2-year training with them. And Joe is amazing in her work with fascia. She's written 2 books. She's got more coming. The latest one is Myofascial Magic in Action. And she is a phenomenal anatomy teacher. She makes it live. And learning about fascia from about 2004 or 5 onwards, that I found transformational.
Imagine, and at a time when no one was really talking about it then, it was only in certain places, and it just transforms your understanding of what we're teaching, right? When you understand this whole system of biotensegrity in the body. If you could go back in time and give your younger self some advice, what would that be, Dinah?
Don't worry so much. Don't worry and trust the process, basically.
And finally, what has been the most profound gift that Pilates has given you?
I would say it was part of something else, but Pilates was part of that, and a second chance at life, basically.
I love that. I can see that. And if someone wants to work with you, they're listening, they want to work with you. It might be a teacher that wants to work with you, but also a client. I'm loving that so many of the clients, I was in the studio today and they're like, I've listened to the podcast, Nick. It's great. They're loving hearing these conversations too, which is blowing my mind. How can people work with you? How can they find out more about what you're doing?
So I have a website, which is menopausepilates.com, but you can email me. I have a newsletter, which you can sign up to, I think, via the website, but definitely via my Instagram. The CPD for teachers, I'm running one online in June. I haven't taught it for over a year because life has been very, very busy, but I taught it in person twice in London last year and once in Bristol. But the next presentation is online because it's easier for people all around, for sure. So if you're a teacher and you want to learn about it, then that's coming up. And again, you can contact me, just email me, dinah@menopausepilates.com. But yeah, you can always message me on Instagram, and I have an online studio as well as my in-person studio. So I run online classes, Menopause Pilates as well.
Thank you. We'll add all of those to the show notes as well, so people can click on those to follow you. Dinah, it's been such a pleasure. It's been lovely to get to know you. I really appreciate you giving me your time today.
Nick, thank you. Thank you very much for sparing your time to spend with me. And it is always lovely to talk about Pilates. And I can't quite believe I've been in this sphere for 27 years now.
I know the years start going past. I was like, stop. I need to stop adding things up,
Yeah, but it's great. And it's great that you're doing this because, I think podcasts are really helpful for people. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, thank you for coming on. It's been a pleasure. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. I'm really grateful that you're here, and I'm loving building this community with you all. Make sure you click the follow button so you don't miss an episode. New ones come out every Monday. And if you found today's content helpful, it would mean a lot if you left a 5-star review, or even better, shared it with someone you think would enjoy it too. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next week.